Put yourself in the shoes of a man caught between his own death and the knowledge that his life meant either the freedom or enslavement of the majority of nations and peoples on this planet. Put yourself in the shoes of Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the end of not only his last term as President of the United States, but at the end of his life. Were he to live, he could bring prosperity and peace to the nations of the world. But were his death or weakness to paralyze him, other forces would take over and act to oppress and put down nations and to undo everything that he had worked to build up. Put yourself in the shoes of one of history's great men. Roosevelt had done the unimaginable in only a little over a decade in office. He entered the presidency at the height of the Great Depression. Unemployment was at an all-time high. People had no money, no food, no productive work. Children were forced to beg for pennies on the streets of a desperate society. And everyday traffic was blocked by the long lines in front of the employment office. Society had no future. Roosevelt's inauguration had launched the greatest economic recovery the world was to ever see. Roosevelt broke from the control of the government by Wall Street's monetarism and instead went back to the principles of the U.S. Constitution to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Utilizing the might and power of the U.S. government and its control of credit through a sovereign dollar, he reorganized the economic system, calling a bank holiday, guaranteeing all bank deposits, and made the federal government a shareholder in thousands of undercapitalized banks, and refinanced millions of home and farm mortgages. He set up the Securities and Exchange Commission, created Social Security, and turned the Federal Reserve into a government-run national bank. And through the Works Progress Administration and Reconstruction Finance Corps, Roosevelt launched a public works program which employed 60% of the jobless in productive jobs, renovating 2,500 hospitals, 45,000 schools, 13,000 parks and playgrounds, 7,800 bridges, 700,000 miles of roads, and 1,000 airfields. He employed 50,000 teachers, rebuilt the country's entire rural school system, and hired 3,000 writers, musicians, sculptors, and painters. And with programs such as the Tennessee Valley Authority, Roosevelt finally finished Abraham Lincoln's efforts for reconstruction of the South. He built the Grand Coulee Dam, the Lincoln Tunnel, and the Chicago lakefront, bringing a booming and secure economy to the United States. But most importantly of all, Roosevelt had rekindled the relationship between the individual and the productive process in society. The greater density of infrastructure and work overall transformed every aspect of the productive process. The electrification of rural America allowed farmers to receive the benefits of electricity, producing more and more efficiently with less backbreaking labor. Their minds were freed up for creativity and innovation. The effects of an integrated transport system and communications network allowed for a greater dissemination of ideas. Increases in new technology in the medical field extended the life expectancy of the average citizen. Scientific progress and productivity drove the economy forward, increasing the role of society to protect and increase the welfare of the people. And the population was moralized once again to do the impossible. With the U.S. entry into the war, Roosevelt used the productive capacity he had built up in the 30s, retooling the factory floor space of auto production facilities and transforming it into the powerhouse for the arsenal of democracy to secure victory in World War II. U.S. production turned the tide of the World War, and soon the Allies were storming onto the beaches at Normandy. The United States stood at the height of its power and production. and was, at that moment, the greatest economy the world had ever seen. However, sitting there in his office, weeks before his death, Roosevelt was faced with a critical dilemma. Though he had brought the United States out from the brink of depression, the rest of the world lived in a tragedy. Europe was devastated by the war. The economies of Germany, France, Poland were in a shambles. Cities had been bombed. Healthcare, education, and police infrastructure was barely non-existent in some areas. And in the Third World, it was even worse. Decades of imperial rule over these nations by the British Empire had held them down in the most backwards and degenerate of conditions. Places such as Africa stood in utter poverty, living off of land that was barely fit for survival. India and other nations had populations that were on the verge of starvation. Roosevelt had not just wanted to free the United States. He wanted to free the whole world and bring the same productive power and development that had built up the U.S. economy to nations everywhere. But such a mission would have the British Empire to contend with. Globally, nations were still ruled by the British imperial system. The United States was the only nation in history that had freed itself from that system. The British Empire halted the development of nations and enslaved the populace in order to rule over them. It was the age-old system of imperialism that Roosevelt faced at the end of the war. And he knew that if he was to destroy that system, he would have to destroy its greatest tool, the mechanism of international monetarism, and replace it instead with the principles of the U.S. Constitution and a credit system, whereby the U.S. dollar could serve as the vehicle for credit for the large-scale development of nations. Roosevelt vowed that arbitrary monetary value controlled by an imperial elite would no longer decide the future of nations. Just as the New Deal gave the United States sovereign control over their own uttering of currency for rebuilding the nation, Roosevelt envisioned that by extending the credit system of the United States internationally, sovereign nations could control their own future and develop their citizenry freely. But for this, a new international framework had to be built.
Venus was so mad that he shook. Sousa Kosa was just furious. The head delegate from India was just as furious as could be. Will somebody please tell me what is going on with the second committee?
I can't stand it anymore. I refuse to continue sitting on this committee. And the problem is that Keynes, he read the bank long after Harry looked at the fund, so his performance tends to be rushed. But I guess, given his position, it's understandable, although tactless.
Come on, Dean. You know there's no comparison between the two programs. His performance is worse than bad.
You have to understand his position.
I think I understand his position.
All right,
please tell
enough arguing. Will somebody please tell me what the problem is? Dean, you sit on that committee. What is it? Let's be frank here. If I may be frank, when Dean gets upset, which is a rare thing, something must be gravely wrong.
Well, the first problem with the bank is that the commission meetings on the bank, which are run by Keynes, are being rushed in this perfectly impossible and outrageous way. So he knows this thing inside and out, and you have to understand that he's got this extreme pressure on him. So when anyone says Section 15C, he knows it. No one else in the room knows it. So before they can turn to it to see what it is he's talking about, he'll say, and hearing no objections, it's passed. Well, they're still trying to find Section 15C. And then he says, we're now talking about 26D. And they begin fiddling around with their papers, and before they can find that, it is passed.
Dean, why don't you just go in there and tell Keynes he's losing everybody in the committee the way he's handling these meetings? I'll do it even. I'll go in there in a perfectly calm, nice way and tell Keynes that at least half a dozen people have come to me perfectly livid and that I think that he's making a big mistake. And I'll even ask him if he wouldn't mind doing the thing at half speed.
The thing is, though, I think I understand why he's doing it. He wants to make sure the meeting's finished before Wednesday when the train leaves.
Dean! Just because he's an autocrat doesn't mean you have to take it from him. Just go in there and you tell him what you think about him. I'll even go into the next meeting. I'll tell him that I think he's just taking the thing too fast. He's losing everybody. Look, the problem is nobody tells him what they think about him. They're either too nice or they're too scared. I think you should go in there with the whole crowd behind you. He'll change his position.
The American delegation to the Bretton Woods Monetary Conference of 1944 was headed up by Morgenthau, Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury, who was also the president of the conference, and Harry Dexter White, one of Roosevelt's chief economists and head of the Treasury Division of Economic Research. Also included were Assistant Secretary of State Dean Acheson, former Utah banker turned chairman of the Federal Reserve Mariner Eccles, and Fred Vinson, one-time congressman and then director of the Office of Economic Stabilization, who later became President Truman's Treasury Secretary. Roosevelt deployed them to represent his vision for the post-war world and to bring that vision to bear on the 44 nations gathered at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to set up a new post-war international economic framework. Roosevelt and the U.S. delegation, especially Morgenthau and White, proposed a system whereby the ability of the United States to utter credit in the form of U.S. dollars was key. They proposed to have the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency, tied to gold, upon which all other currencies would be fixed. This would allow for the might of the U.S. economy to play a direct role in guaranteeing credit for long-term productive development, such as power systems, the development of nuclear energy, the mass greening of the African desert, and a system of interconnecting high-speed rail networks. For such a vision, it was crucial that a strong and stable currency was the central reserve currency. Otherwise, no nations would be willing to accept credit, except in the form of gold. And there was not enough gold in the whole of the world which could fund the enormity of the scale of project Roosevelt intended for after the war. Early in 1943, before any plan was published, White had told a group of economists, "The dollar is the one great currency in whose strength there is universal confidence. It will probably become the cornerstone of the post-war structure of stable currencies." The only problem was dealing with the British. The British brought a delegation of economists, lawyers, and accountants, all headed up by representative economist John Maynard Keynes, a staunch advocate of the British imperial system of economics, who in the preface to the German edition of his General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, said he preferred having his book published in Nazi Germany, the same Nazi Germany we had just fought a war against, because it would receive more approval from the Nazis than other democratic audiences. Keynes was an accountant and an autocrat to the core. Since his early childhood, Keynes had a fascination with counting and tabulating everything. As a child, he knew the number of steps on every single one of the porches in his neighborhood. And when he got older, he would record every single one of his sexual encounters, dutifully tabulating who he had sex with and what kind of encounter it was. This was the personality the Americans had to deal with at Bretton Woods. From the very beginning, there was an air of tenseness and mistrust between the American and the British delegation, and particularly between Harry Dexter White and John Maynard Keynes. Keynes scoffed at the American way of doing things, objecting to the number of lawyers on the U.S. side and making snide remarks about rabbinics, referring to the Jewish officials at the Treasury, such as White and Edward Bernstein. He was in ill health with chronic heart problems, having suffered from a dangerous heart attack in 1937. He couldn't take the stresses of the meetings and discussions at Bretton Woods, refused to have any meetings or gatherings after dinner time, and was frequently described as under heavy stress, with which he clearly didn't cope too well. Keynes's proposal for Bretton Woods was directly opposed to the American one. John Maynard Keynes proposed to set up a global financial authority called the International Clearing or Currency Union that would issue a global currency, the Bancor, later known as Unitas, by which all international trade would be measured. The key to his proposal was that nations were to achieve a balance of trade. Creditor nations would strive within a small percentage or so not to export more than they imported, and debtor nations would strive not to import more than they exported. Any imbalances or trade deficits on the part of creditor or debtor would be charged an interest fee on the overdrawn account, paid directly to the ICU. Essentially, what Keynes was proposing was a giant worldwide central bank. However, if such a system were to be implemented, it would mean that the financing of valuable infrastructure projects to build up developing nations would halt to a minimum. Any sort of economic development or imports from creditor nations by a debtor nation would enslave the debtor nation to the ICU, forcing them to pay and pay and pay up. So although Keynes's system, which was nominally supposed to encourage creditor nations to convert their surplus money from cutting exports into bankers and invest those into debtor nations, did allow for minimal development and innovation, it never allowed for the large-scale, powerful reconstruction Roosevelt wanted. In short, it would never allow the debtor or developing nation to reach a status equal with other nations. And it would never allow for the kind of science-driven creative projects necessary for a productive and flourishing society. Indeed, in devising this plan, Keynes admitted to drawing on Hitler's economic minister's Hjalmar Schacht's plan to use clearing arrangements to permit the Third Reich to continue importing raw materials for its military buildup in the 1930s. Two systems, Roosevelt's system of credit and Keynes's system of central banking, guided the discussions at Bretton Woods. The question was, which would be adopted in the international framework for the post-war world? In 1943, Keynes had told White that the United Kingdom would not go on a dollar standard and rejected that the dollar should be given any sort of special status. Every time the subject was brought up, he categorically refused to discuss it. He denounced it when it was brought up at the UN conference in Atlantic City and submitted statements to the press saying the plan would not even be brought up for consideration. And of course, the statement of principles, as it was submitted to the Bretton Woods Conference, clearly stated that the par value of a member's currency shall be expressed in terms of gold. Deployed by Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Dexter White took a series of 3 brilliant steps, known only to his closest associates, and changed the course of history by making sure the U.S. dollar became the reserve currency and cornerstone for the Bretton Woods system. On July 6, at the 2:30 p.m. meeting of Committee 2, White made his first move. White submitted an alternative known as Alternative A, which provided that the par value of the currency of each member shall be expressed in terms of gold as a common denominator, or in terms of a gold convertible currency unit of the weight and fineness in effect on July 1st, 1944. And with the insertion of that key phrase, gold convertible currency unit, and White's nonchalant presentation of the alternative, acting as if the matter had already been decided and was obviously necessary, led to the approval of the alternative that day with no further discussion. The alternative became part of the massive material accrued by the various committees, and its far-reaching implications went unnoticed. The next move by White was made 1 week later, July 13th, at a meeting of Commission 1, where White himself was the chairman. Before the meeting, he let Morgenthau know that the commission meeting that afternoon was crucial for what happened the rest of the conference. The Indian delegation, recalling that Keynes had over and over again made statements that gold convertible currency did not exist, asked for clarification on the definition of gold convertible currency. British delegate Robertson, against Keynes's instructions, suggested that the vague phrase gold and gold convertible currency be replaced by gold and US dollars, and the subsequent changes this shift required be made. White, as chairman, referred the matter to a special committee which he would then head up. That night, White made his final move. The special committee met late in the evening and worked until 3 o'clock in the morning preparing the final draft of the IMF document, with the special provision of gold and US dollars included in it. The next day, White reported to Morgenthau that the draft on the International Monetary Fund was in excellent shape, and the seemingly small change from gold to gold and US dollars was lost in the expanse of the 96-page document presented to the delegates a few days later. Keynes didn't find out about the change until later, when he finally read the completed act. Finally, after weeks of negotiations and many other maneuvers pulled off by the Americans, and after at least one mild heart attack suffered by Keynes, the final details of the International Monetary Fund and the Bank for Reconstruction and Development were hammered out, and the Bretton Woods agreements were complete. The 44 nations who had participated in the agreements participated in an international framework of fixed exchange rate currencies, all pegged to the dollar, which was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. But this was no gold standard or even dollar standard system. The agreements operated off of a gold reserve system, meaning a nation need only have enough gold in their treasury to account for trade imbalances. Dollars were to be used as credit for funding large-scale infrastructure and development projects and for cooperation between nations. The job of the IMF was to keep the fixed exchange rate stable. Nations were not allowed to upvalue or devalue their currency without going through a series of stopgap measures to ensure the whole system itself remained stable. This way, though the agreements made sure to have flexible exchange rates during the transition period, immediately following the war, when the economic standing of certain nations was not yet determined, ultimately the goal was to create a fixed, stable system of exchange rates so that nations could not only have prosperous trade relationships, but so that projects, long-term projects lasting 25 to 50 years, could be financed and built without massive fluctuations in cost. Therefore, a project to connect Europe and Asia by rail could be built over a period of approximately 25 years at a relatively the same ending cost for the nations involved as had been projected from the start. Building materials, such as iron or other metals for the rail tracks, power systems, energy supplies, could all be obtained and traded under the fixed exchange rate system at a reasonable cost with low rates of interest. And this was only the tip of the iceberg of what the Bretton Woods Agreement, under their original form and with the power of Franklin Roosevelt's USA behind them, could do. With Roosevelt at the helm, the Americans had succeeded in bringing the credit system of the United States, the system that had gotten us out of the Depression and built up the arsenal of democracy, to the international stage.
And when Roosevelt was dying, while in office, shortly after his installation, fourth inauguration, Donovan went into the office to meet with the president and came out gray-faced, saying to a friend of mine who was with him at the time, "It's over. It's over." Under these conditions, the intention of the formation of the United Nations and the intention of the Bretton Woods system was subverted because the intention had been to free colonial nations by large-scale infrastructural projects and other things of development of these nations, and to protect them while they emerged from colonial status into sovereign nation-state private. So therefore, the purpose, Roosevelt's purpose for the Bretton Woods system was not carried out. Under these conditions, where the British were taking more and more of a controlling role over the Anglo-American policy in the post-war period, the policies tended to go in the direction of Keynes's speech in 1944. So Roosevelt's intention was not Keynesian, but the British intention and Truman's intention was.
Franklin Roosevelt, a great man who had led the United States and the world to victory over fascism and oppression, was replaced by a very little man, Harry S. Truman, and the United States was never the same again. The British Empire, who Franklin Roosevelt vowed to use the might and resources of the United States of America to defeat, moved in to take over the U.S. presidency. But the ghost of Roosevelt still haunted the British in the form of the Bretton Woods system. They knew that mere corruption of the United States would not work. The mechanism by which the United States credit system could operate internationally had to be removed. And so, with the consent of the new President of the United States, a traitor to Roosevelt and his nation, Harry S. Truman. The plans were laid to first corrupt and finally destroy the Bretton Woods system. But even for the British, this would be a task to accomplish. The system of Bretton Woods functioned by maintaining a strong and powerful dollar. Nations were allowed to demand gold instead of dollars for certain transactions if they deemed the dollar was too weak or unstable. So as long as the US dollar was being widely issued as credit for projects to benefit the welfare and productive power of other nations, and as long as the United States economy itself was prosperous and powerful, the dollar had a strong value directly tied to the industrial strength and growth of our economy. But the British Empire knew that if the dollar was widely issued for speculative purposes, and if the U.S. dropped its role as an economic powerhouse, the dollar would not accrue any actual value and would face collapse. For hundreds of years since the recoinage of 1696 by propagandist John Locke and then Warden of the Mint Isaac Newton, the British, as the Venetians before them, used their control of money or gold to manipulate world finance. Currency devaluation and speculation was one of their chief methods of economic warfare. The devaluation of the British pound in 1931 created such chaos in international markets and trade that it was a major factor in the length and depth of the ensuing economic depression. So following the creation of the Bretton Woods system, the British reverted to their old tricks to get rid of it. Since the end of World War II, the British pound had been known as the sick man of the system. Throughout the war, they had accumulated an enormous influx of sterling debts, and knew that if they cancelled or decreased their debts, London would decline as a banking center, and there would be a rapid disintegration of the empire and the Commonwealth. If the debts remained, however, devaluation was imminent. However, the British Empire never intended to get rid of Britain's sterling debts in the first place. They wanted Britain to continue being the sick man of the system, to serve their own sinister purposes. And since the British pound sterling was the second reserve currency, second only to the dollar, they knew that any sharp shift in the value of Britain's currency would send shockwaves through the entire fixed exchange rate system and would destabilize the dollar. The first devaluation came in 1949. Under the rules of Bretton Woods, no country was allowed to devalue their currency by more than 1.5% without the consent of the IMF, and by no more than 8% without the consent of the other 44 nations invested in the fund. Despite these regulations, the British, with the consent of the Truman government to back them up, unlawfully devalued their pound by a whopping 30.5%, bringing the value from $4.03 to $2.80. It was the job of the IMF to use loans and other funds to stabilize the pound, and the enactment of the Marshall Plan for Reconstruction of Europe should have rebuilt the British economy to the point where it had a stable currency. The British rejected all of these safeguards. They rejected the Marshall Plan, and the pound sterling continued to plummet and fluctuate throughout the 50s and 60s. To keep the value of the pound sterling down and to continue devaluation, the British were willing to destroy their very own people in their nation and commonwealth. Starting in the 50s, the British began a systemic takedown of their infrastructure and a destruction of their economy. Unemployment soared to record highs. In 1958, while European currencies became convertible to the dollar and foreign exchange markets across the world opened up, the British people were not allowed to enjoy currency convertibility to the dollar. Similarly, the British put enormous taxes on imported goods and goods containing raw materials imports, all the while increasing exports. They essentially created cheap labor conditions in Britain and the Commonwealth. Advocates of the devaluation policy said that the only way long-term benefits of devaluation could be secured was if the people simply bore the cost. Wages would have to be lower, domestic consumption would have to be reduced, and government spending on healthcare, welfare, and other social services would have to be cut. The British acted in a manner against the very principles of the United States. They did not act as a sovereign nation. A nation has a commitment to the welfare of its own citizenry. The British Empire was willing to destroy Britain and the Commonwealth for the purposes of defending the empire. In the United States, Britain's currency manipulations caused runs on U.S. gold. International markets, looking at the weak value of sterling, stopped putting faith into the strength of the U.S. dollar. Meanwhile, following the war, plans to convert the U.S. war machine for peacetime economic reconstruction and development were limited. The United States under Truman shifted toward a consumer society. The UN development programs promised by FDR to rebuild the Third World never got off the ground, and by the 1960s, the development decades were doing more harm than good, advocating green technology and sustainable development over high-tech infrastructure and productive power. But it wasn't until Harold Wilson's Labour government that Britain's policy of devaluation was really put into effect, and the final offensive against Bretton Woods was run. In November 1967, IMF Managing Director Pierre-Paul Schweitzer, who was avidly against the Bretton Woods system and a very close friend of London's Bank of England, was approached by Wilson for a loan of $3 billion to save the pound. In what was a clear setup, Schweitzer, going against the original purpose of the IMF, turned down the request of Great Britain. 1 week later, on November 17th, using the rejection by the IMF as an excuse, the pound was devalued by 14.3%. The London gold pool began to immediately sell off England's gold to meet the $35 an ounce price. This created a panic that the dollar was also weakening. In 1968, there was a huge run on U.S. gold. Meanwhile, the London gold market, which had been shut down by FDR, but was revived under the consent of traders in the United States as a separate entity, under no regulation by Bretton Woods, raised the price of their gold to $44 an ounce, creating a two-tiered gold market and a haven for speculators. Financial speculators would trade U.S. gold, purchased at $35 an ounce, into the London gold market and get back $44. Making a 25% profit, essentially for free. The rampant speculation forced a devaluation of the dollar and led to even more panic. Monetary crises began crashing in waves. Other countries, their currencies in ruins because of the instability in the fixed exchange rate system, began to float their currencies. Canada, a member of the British Commonwealth, instituted a permanent float to its currency first, setting a precedent for other nations to follow suit. Finally, in 1970, Schweitzer demanded that the U.S. use its gold reserves to finance its deficits. But the U.S. was low on gold reserves to begin with. The United States had held nearly 2/3 of the world's gold right after the Bretton Woods agreements were signed. But after the crises of 69 and 70, it was left with less than 10% of its former gold reserves. With little faith internationally in the U.S. dollar, and following violent shocks in the markets, the United States took itself off the fixed exchange rate system. The murder of Franklin Roosevelt's legacy was now complete.
In recent weeks, the speculators have been waging an all-out war on the American dollar. The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
The takedown of Bretton Woods opened the door for London's financial predators to come in to destroy the United States. The IMF and the World Bank, institutions intended by Roosevelt to save developing nations from the British Empire, became the tools used to enslave them. our US dollar was torn from the physical economy of the United States and became an instrument of speculation. It was no longer a tool of credit as conceived by the founders of our Republican Constitution. And with no leadership, with no productive mission orientation guiding the development of our citizenry, the United States took down its industrial economy, with the final remnants of the U.S. machine tools sector dismantled in 2008. And now we are in the midst of the greatest economic collapse in history. It took the British nearly 30 years to murder the spirit of Franklin Roosevelt in the form of the Bretton Woods system, and it took them another 40 to wipe him out of the memory of the citizenry of the United States. Ultimately, however, the death or life of his soul lies not with the British Empire. It is not their manipulations of nations that will destroy his legacy. He is dead only if we allow him to die. With a revival now of the principles on which he operated, the principles embedded in our great Constitution, and a revival of the idea of a credit system for not only the United States but the world, through a new Bretton Woods agreement between the United States, Russia, China, and India, we can revive the spirit of FDR. We can continue the work that Roosevelt began to develop sovereign nations across the globe and to raise the standard of living of the world. And we would revive his mission not for his sake, but for ours, and for the sake of all humanity.